if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get the panel started here very soon. My name is Alex Imes. I'm with the Fairfax County Economic Development Authority, and I'd like to welcome you to this program, How AI is Affecting National Security Strategy. So we're here to help you with all of your business needs in Fairfax County. We have 550 cybersecurity companies in the county. We have 60 universities producing 12,000 graduates in computer science and cyber-related capacities. This is going to be an excellent panel. We have a truly distinguished lineup for you. Our moderator is Jon Darby, Director of Operations, retired NSA, and panelist Greg Crabb, CISO in Residence, Ballistic Ventures, Lieutenant General, retired Charlie Moore, former Deputy Commander, U.S. Cyber Command, and Dr. Kristen Summers, Vice President and Technical Fellow, Data and AI from Mantech. Again, thank you all for being here, and Jon, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. So it's a pleasure for us to be here today. We've got a great panel of experts here in AI and national security. And before we kick off the dialogue with us, I just wanted to run down and have each panelist say a little bit more about their background beyond just the headline that was just mentioned, so you can get a sense of where we're all coming from. So as for me, as mentioned, former Director of Operations at NSA, worked in the intelligence community for about 39 years, mainly on the signals intelligence side, but also cybersecurity aspect as well. So with that, over to Kristen.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Kristen Summers. I'm a Technical Fellow and Vice President in Data and AI in Mantech's Data and AI practice. And I have been working in and around AI throughout my career, actually since my undergraduate thesis on neural networks in 1991. So I've been around for a couple of cycles of changes in the AI space and how we use it and think about it. And I'm really excited to bring the capabilities to clients to help them do their work more easily. And most of my career, that has really been focused on government.
Thank you, Kristen. So, Greg Crabb. I am currently CISO in Residence with Ballistic Ventures. I joined them about 6 months ago. And prior to that, I served 30 years in the U.S. government, 25 as a federal law enforcement officer, and the last 7 of which was the Chief Information Security Officer at the U.S. Postal Service, and get a great opportunity to work with early stage startups around this AI and data space. Really excited to be here.
Thanks a lot. I'm Charlie Moore. I retired about 2 years ago as the Deputy Commander at U.S. Cyber Command after 33 years in the Air Force. I spent the first 2/3 of my career in the flying business, flying F-16s and doing all those jobs, and then the last third really focused in the cyber domain, helping the department to figure out full spectrum cyberspace operations, offensive operations, defensive operations, and information operations.
All right, well, we'll kick it off, and we're going to continue talking about AI as relative to national security. I think everybody here knows, the term AI really caught on across the whole the world, frankly, about 2 years ago. Well, frankly, AI has been in use for decades before that, whether you know it or not. Inventory management, facial recognition, traffic management, it's a whole variety of things. It's how it helps us live our lives. But what about national security? I mean, there's no doubt that AI plays a role in national security today and will continue to do so in the future. Some see AI as an opportunity in national security from a strategic standpoint. Some see it as a challenge. It's actually both. So we need to be mindful of both as we seek out opportunities to apply AI to national security. So let's start with General Moore. Charlie, what do you think? Is AI a threat to national security?
So I think you summarized it well, actually, there with your comments, that it's definitely an opportunity and it's something we need to capitalize. And if we do that, it will be a positive from a national security perspective. And if we don't do that, it's going to be a negative. And I think the way that we need to capitalize on it is to actually come up with a national level strategy for how we're going to approach these advanced capabilities. The good news is, I think over the last month and even last week, we've got some pretty positive indicators from my perspective about how the new administration wants to approach this from a national security perspective. First, with the executive order that the president signed just a few weeks ago that said, hey, the United States is going to lead in this space. We're going to set the gold standard for artificial intelligence. We want to figure out how we can help it to advance humanity. We want to figure out how we can fully realize all its economic benefits and also partnerships. He also directed the senior leaders within the government to come back within 6 months with an action plan. And in my world, I'm reading that as a strategy, which is what I hope it is. We also saw some pretty good indicators from the vice president's speech. I'm sure most of you saw that or have seen clips of it last week in Paris, where he further expanded upon what the executive order laid out. Again, to make the United States the gold standard, the leader in AI, but just as importantly, to do with our partners and allies. Second, he wanted to cut down on all the regulation that we were seeing starting to develop and within the environment, which I think is very good news. Third, they wanted to focus on AI being unbiased and to move away from any type of censorship. And finally, to focus on jobs. Instead of being concerned about this being a job killer, focus on how it can be a job promoter and increase our efficiencies across the government. So if we do those things that are really values and objectives and turn that into a workable strategy, I think it's going to be a very big positive from a national security perspective.
Yeah, I do like the term, the action plan that's needed. At least in my experience, I've seen strategies. Well, actually, to advance a strategy, you've got to have things to do, specific, tangible things. So I'll be interested to see how that action plan develops over the next 6 months across the administration. So no matter what role AI plays in national security strategy, there's going to be risks. So, Kristen, from your perspective, what are the risks of using AI in national security strategy?
Yeah, thanks. So I really like talking about this because I find that a lot of government clients can be hesitant to use AI because they're worried that it may be very risky. And there are risks, but they also can absolutely be addressed. There are risks that come with any piece of software, right? So anytime you're using AI or integrating AI into what you're doing, there's software involved, and all of the standard cybersecurity concerns can apply, and you need to audit that and vet that, and we heard a lot about that in the previous two talks, so I won't repeat it, but that's a super important aspect of it. Then in addition, AI is very often hosted someplace else, right? So this is, again, something that you have to deal with a lot of software, but it's especially likely to be true and especially likely to be complex with AI solutions, as we were hearing about. Well, what if it's sort of fourth party, right? You're going pretty far down the supply chain, and you still need to understand what's happening with your data that you're providing to it, whether it's in a retrieval augmented generation system, RAG, where you're providing some of your own data to the model to operate on, or whether it's a matter of the data that is implied and present simply in the prompts you're giving it or the questions you're asking. And those are generative AI examples, but with other kinds of AI as well, with a conventional machine learning model. If you are putting some data into it in order to get a result, let's say you're using machine translation, right? The information you're putting into it to get translated may be something where you really want to understand what is happening with that data? What are the places it's residing? And what are the terms of service? How might it be reused? So all of those things that are in some sense standard for software, but maybe particularly salient for AI, are important. But then I also think it's important to be cognizant of some of the risks that are a little bit more specific to AI. And I really think about that in terms of what might happen with intentional misuse and what might happen as a result of ordinary use, right? So AI systems can be vulnerable to adversarial methods. I think by now we've probably all seen some examples of images where, it looks like, I forget, cookies and it's puppies or the other way around, right? And the AI gets wrong which thing it is. By changing things a little bit, you can make the AI get something wrong, but you can also, especially with generative AI, perhaps elicit information that model was not supposed to give, right? So you want to think about the risks that come from those techniques. And one of the things that needs to happen typically is if you do have data that's very sensitive and you do really want to protect against that, you probably need to think about the full application and system around the AI model, not just what controls are built into the model, but also creating some guardrails around what it's even possible for that model to access or reveal in a given context. And then there are the risks that come from ordinary, totally appropriate use, but where people may over-rely on results that are uncertain or that may be biased. Sometimes we find that AI systems magnify bias that's present in the data that they're using. And so there's a risk, right, that people will just sort of accept the AI result and move on without thinking about it or without looking at the sources. And so it's really helpful both to train people in terms of what to look for and to provide user interfaces and user experiences that really encourage that kind of interaction.
Great, thanks. So you mentioned the guardrails, to help to mitigate risks. So in the prior administration, there was an executive order issued to basically put in place some of these guidelines to mitigate the risks associated with AI technologies. Now, a lot folks in big tech didn't like that. EO said, putting regulations in place stifles innovation. Well, the current administration ditched that EO, and has issued a new one that Charlie mentioned before with its approach. So over to you, Greg. So how do you think AI risks should be mitigated while ensuring both security and compliance are protected?
Yeah, great question, John. And I think that a lot of organizations in the commercial sector are running to implement systems and applications built on large language models, and they're not considering security in that development process. And then when the CISO or the compliance office finds out about the rogue development of their AI application, it comes to a halt. And I think that there's a lot of things that we as the community of investors and entrepreneurs need to be doing in order to address those risks. And so we need to think about that development supply chain. Where are we on that journey to having secure and compliant artificial intelligence applications and making them so that they're repeatable from a compliance and regulatory perspective. As we, I've had the opportunity to talk with a bunch of entrepreneurs today, and of course we're going to use a large language model in order to be able to maximize our data. But are you thinking about how do you do that in a secure and safe way? And so I encourage us as practitioners to think about what that supply chain of development looks like. And at Ballistic Ventures, we're taking a very proactive approach in investing in that secure supply chain from a development perspective. We've got one of our investments is putting guardrails on our employee use of large language models. It's called Witness AI, a great organization. Another investment that we've made is how do we put composable security APIs together so that large language models can be used in a role-based access context with proper logging and monitoring. There's a company in our portfolio called Pangea that's doing that from a supply chain and development perspective. And then finally, how do we manage all of the unique vulnerabilities that come about from the OWASP LLM top 10 and prompt injection attacks and other model attacks. We've got an investment in a company called Noma that's addressing those issues. I think that there needs to be a lot more investment in that space from a DevSecOps, for maybe we call it AI-SecOps perspective, to be able to manage and mitigate those risks.
All right. So we've been talking about AI being applied to solve problems, in many cases, and the risks associated with that. In many cases, you can actually use AI itself to help mitigate the risks for using AI. So, Kristen, can you tell us a little bit about how AI itself can actually help reduce the risks?
Yeah, absolutely. So we look a lot at how you can use AI to assist in security, right, in mitigating risks. So this is the AI for cybersecurity side of the coin as opposed to the security for AI. One of the things, so AI can absolutely help with direct tasks that are associated with security. For example, interpreting code. So when we think about AI and code, we often think about code assist, right? Help you write better code. But AI can also help interpret code that is available and around. So sometimes that's about just understanding what your legacy code base does, but sometimes it's about inspecting code that you're concerned about and helping you understand what it does so that you can make some security assessments about it. Another aspect is that AI is really good at finding patterns, right? So you can use AI to find patterns in cyber attacks, to find what may be going on either in, on your network at a low level or in behavioral patterns where there may be something to be concerned about. And that can be as simple as anomaly detection, something that's very unusual and you should look at it. It can be more complex in finding patterns that seem to indicate a particular intent or finding patterns that are consistent with other patterns in the past that have been attacks and that sort of thing. So it can absolutely help there. The other thing I want to mention is that sometimes something that people don't necessarily think of is that generative AI can help with interpreting and thinking about information you have. You can use it to help look for logical fallacies or help suggest alternative hypotheses for what may be happening, or just help look at a report and say, well, here are things, interpretations that maybe are weak or other areas you might want to look at. Like we think about it a lot, I think, in terms of doing these initial tasks, or as one of the earlier speakers was talking about, sort of recasting information. But you can also use it in a more interactive way to help you think through things. And that can help make sure that issues aren't missed and you're kind of thinking through all of the potential risks as you're addressing that.
That prompted me, sparked some thinking that I've talked about before about we're moving to a world, I believe, in cybersecurity and AI on AI.
Yeah.
AI-enabled defenses are in place. You've got an AI-enabled capability being directed in a network and will hit the defense. The defense will recognize what that exploit is, how it operates, and alter its defenses. Then the attacker will recognize how that defense has been altered, and you've got this punch, counterpunch, and AI-enabled at machine speed. We're not there yet, but I really believe that's where we are ultimately moving, which has huge implications, across the board. So one of the terms we've heard earlier a few times is agentic AI. First of all, Kristen, can you explain, for everybody that may not know exactly what that means, what is agentic AI, and how can it change the risks?
Yeah, so agentic AI refers to using AI in ways so that it acts as an agent or a set of agents. So what that means, when you break it down a little bit, is typically two things. One is it can take actions. And this doesn't really mean that the model changed and became capable of taking actions. It means it's integrated with something. So if the model, let's say, produces a SQL query, then that's integrated in a way so it can go execute that query. Or it produces an API call, it can go make that API call, or take whatever action makes sense, what that it's connected to and that it's been asked to do. And the other thing that it means is having instances of calling the AI that take on different personas and can interact with each other. So each one acts as an agent for a single thing. And so these things can interact, right? You might have an agent that determines what kind of a query you need to your database, and then an agent that generates that query and executes it, and then an agent that summarizes what came back and explains it to you. And they can interact. You can do things like have one agent look at the output of another agent and recast that information for a different venue, right? Or summarize it, or check that it's consistent with sources, or whatever the things may be. So it refers to that kind of orchestration of different AI tasks, as well as, and taking on sort of the personas of different roles, as well as the ability to actually execute on tasks.
So agentic AI scares some people, you know, because that kind of, you know, are we moving toward the Skynet world of Terminator, that, you know, agents talking to one another and making decisions and so on. And a common theme you hear in dialogues like this, particularly in the national security world, is a human's got to be in the loop somewhere. Yeah, now where remains to be seen. But I'm just curious about your thoughts of the threats of agentic AI, you know, to being applied more broadly.
Yeah, so the way I look at it is that the sources of risk in agentic AI are really the same as the sources of risk in any AI, right? The things we were talking about earlier. But what happens is that if you have AI that can go ahead and take actions, the effects of those risks can become magnified. So one sort of simple example that I just read an article, or that saw an article in the news where someone had asked an agentic AI to go look for inexpensive eggs and check local prices of eggs. And the AI went ahead and ordered eggs to be delivered to his home. And that, you know, went a little far, right? And the fact that it was able to take actions meant that you had the risk of it actually going and spending money on his behalf. And in that instance, you know, it was a fairly small amount of money. He was probably willing to risk that to have some of the benefits of experimenting with the agentic AI. But if you were talking about a much larger amount of money, or if you were talking about something certainly that's a safety concern or something like that, you would definitely have wanted to have a lot more guardrails in place to make sure that that did not happen. The other thing is that when you have a bunch of different agents interacting, and I think you were alluding to this, the interactions can become quite complex. And so tracking down where the risk came from and what's really going to happen can also be more challenging. And so in both of these cases, I think that some of the mitigation is actually very similar to the mitigations of other kinds of AI risks, where you need some kind of guardrails or limitations in the enclosing application. So what are the things that agentic AI is actually allowed to do? What are the actions it can take? You probably want to limit those. Which ones does a human need to sign off on? You probably want to look at that. What kind of transparency do you need as to what happened between your different agents? You probably want to have that and have it be something you can look at. But the other thing that I want to add is that sometimes agentic AI can actually be used to reduce your risk. So because you can have these agents take on different personas, you can have an agent that is looking for risks in the behavior of another agent. And you can do things like, say, have an agent gather information and summarize it, and then have another agent look at whether the summary is actually consistent with the original sources. And so you can reduce some of your risk of things that happen from like hallucinations or bias or those kinds of things by having agents that are specifically designed to address that and surface it when it's happening.
Interesting. Yeah, great. That makes a lot of sense. So Charlie, let's go back to the national security strategy, strategy action plan. So from your perspective, what does an AI strategy or action plan actually look like that allows us to mitigate threats to the United States and our allies, as well as maximize opportunities for us?
Yeah, I think you have to start with understanding and making sure that strategy accounts for the fact that, AI, artificial intelligence, and these advanced tools like it exist inside the cyber or digital domain, and that domain is ubiquitous. And so therefore, any strategy that we're going to develop, if it's going to be effective, it really has to be a whole of society, whole of nation approach. And so much so that we probably haven't seen an approach like this actually since World War II, in terms of the approach across all sectors of our society, private, public, individual, academic, and of course, friends and allies. So that's the first point that I would make. It has to account for that. The second one is, if I was being asked to develop it, which I guess your question is essentially doing, I think you have to have some type of North Star, if you will, or what's the ultimate place that we're aiming? Where do we want to go? And I would describe that really as analytic superiority. And I don't mean analytic superiority just in the terms of the analytics itself. I mean from tooth to tail. So the sensors and the means by which we gather data out in the environment, the means by which we transport that data, the means by which we store that data, the means by which we take that data, run it through analytics, artificial intelligence, using those types of tools, turn that data into information, share that information now with decision makers, be they human or even machine, and continue to perform that process while we're protecting it from our adversaries and their abilities to try to disrupt it or destroy it. At the same time, where we are actually looking to deny, degrade, disrupt, destroy, or manipulate our adversaries' abilities to do the same thing. And if we're running through those processes and doing it at a faster scale and continuing to improve those artificial intelligence tools themselves, then I think we're well on our way towards developing a great strategy. Now, any strategy, as Jon alluded to earlier, has got to start getting down into not just the what we want to accomplish, but how we're going to accomplish it. And so if you start thinking about the different lines of effort, there's many, and far more than we would have time to discuss today. But some of the, I think, more obvious ones are, so how do we go about continuing to innovate and improve the capability of our area tools? Is it public-private partnership? Is it funding? Is it decreasing the regulatory environment, which we mentioned before? Second line of effort that would come to mind is the physical requirements, the infrastructure for data storage, the infrastructure for high-powered compute. How we go about doing that? Everyone, I'm sure, here has read a lot about recently the identification of the problems with having the power necessary just to run these types of capabilities, far more than we have today. Unfortunately, green energy, specifically wind and sun and solar, are not going to do it for us. So we've got to solve that problem from a whole society approach. I would also mention talent. How do we continue to grow, cultivate, employ, retain, especially in key government positions, the talent necessary for us to succeed? And then I would definitely focus on partnerships as well, which we've talked about previously.
Yeah, it's a huge problem.
Yeah.
All the lines of effort, as you say, it's massive. And we need to start thinking at scale when we're talking about AI and applying it to national security strategy, which is different historically. As we talk about AI in the community, it's more on a tactical level. And how do you take all those tactical investments and decisions? How do they roll into a strategic approach to how you use the technology and the capabilities? Now, unlike the US, China, which is still developing a strategy on how to do things like this, China actually does it. I mean, this is a matter of natural strategy. New capabilities, new technologies are naturally integrated into their military and intelligence capabilities. It's a matter of course. And anybody here who's worked with the government know it's not matter of course to work with the government here in the US. It's a pain in the ass, frankly, to get these technologies integrated, and that needs to change. But over to you, Greg. How significant is the risk posed to us by China-sponsored cyber campaigns like Salt Typhoon or Volt Typhoon in conducting espionage or enabling cyber operations or pre-positioning for critical infrastructure disruption if it ever comes to, we come to that level of tension between our two countries?
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail on the head, Jon. I think you've led the witness some there on the response, but I came into being a chief information security officer in government on the heels of the 2014 attacks that China was making against the stores of employee data that the federal government had. For me, it was the U.S. Postal Service that I responded to, and they had stolen our 650,000 employee personal information, and spent the next 7 years trying to deal with how do I prevent attacks like that from occurring in my organization, and a couple of years later had to deal with the impacts of my entire customer identity and access management practice based on Equifax and reconfiguring that as a result of their attacks on Equifax. So China, for the last you know, I remember one of my first briefings when I got my Q clearance at the Department of Energy was the China threat of stealing intellectual property from our research institutions in the Department of Energy. And, you know, they've been doing this for 30 years. And imagine an adversary that with Salt Typhoon has access to the Department of Treasury and stealing all the Department of Treasury data and integrating that with all of the other data stores that they have and using artificial intelligence to do the types of things that Kristen talked about relative to the great things that you can do from a use case perspective with artificial intelligence. Our adversary is driving forward at a very aggressive pace, and it's built on the back of a lot of information that's been stolen from us. They, quite frankly, have probably better optics on our society relative to their thefts than we do on ourselves. So, you know, I'm going to give that advantage to China right now relative to their capabilities to beat us in a national security game.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, one of the things I often talk about when I talk about the threat of China, it's not just military, economic, intelligence, but the fact that they're developing advanced technologies and, more importantly, proliferating and integrating into the global economy. You know, we've got to have eyes wide open with those kinds of capabilities that are in our economic infrastructure, for example. So you mentioned, Greg, earlier about supply chain. So how does China's strategic approach to AI development, despite the U.S. export controls, highlight vulnerabilities in the global semiconductor supply chain?
It's clear. Obviously, I used to be responsible for global security for the Postal Service and have to implement those export control laws and rules across the vast shipping system that we had. And China is very adept at being able to circumvent those to obtain the technologies that they need. So I don't believe that our declaration of export controls is preventing China from being able to access this technology. Secondly, clearly they have access to Taiwan and are going to exploit every capability they have in order to be able to get access to the manufacturing of our chip technologies, understand how those chips are being made there, and obviously we have likely in the next several years an imminent challenge with China and Taiwan. So I think we need to think about that from a national security perspective and understand that it's not just the Taiwan's independence, but it's our national security that's at stake in that exchange. And what is preventing China from being able to leverage all of the resources that are being made available by OpenAI and others to be able to do their own development? The prohibitions on Chinese nationals from being able to have accounts at OpenAI and be able to use that for their bidding, I don't see anything that's stopping them, right? And so I think the barriers to us being in a position to be able to stop them from using the technologies that underlie and develop artificial intelligence, another win in the bucket of China from a national security perspective and from my perspective.
Yeah, and there's lots of different levers that U.S. and our allies can use to counter that. When we talk about from a strategic standpoint, we talked about the lines of effort, but another aspect of cutting that is, there's diplomatic, there's economic, there's military, different levers of national power to apply to counter China and other adversaries from a national security and, frankly, economic security, because economic security equals national security. But so using as an old military professional, I'm sorry, seasoned military professional. So let's talk about the military lever of U.S. and allied national power. What should the execution of our strategy look like, and how do we posture for success in the future?
So that's a great question. So you laid it out very well. So if we just totally go into that military lane, I think the first thing to do is to recognize that there's a changing character of war that's going on. The nature of war never changes, right? It's ultimately about two different organizations or groups or nation states or whatever trying to force the other to do something that they want them to do. Start doing something or stop doing something, and to use force to do it. But the character of war, the way that that manifests itself in the current environment is constantly changing. And right now, what we're seeing is interesting time where you have increasing technological capabilities, including tools like AI, decreasing cost, increasing availability, and then the rate at which we're seeing the change of those things is accelerating. And so it makes for a very unique time. If I was gonna zero in though, as you asked, John, inside the DoD and how that then nests under that national level strategy, I think the DoD really needs to focus in three big areas. One is the continuous improvement of those AI tools themselves, so we can basically gain informational advantage and decisional advantage over adversaries from the tactical to the strategic level. The second is to use those AI tools and the decision-making capabilities that they present in the physical environment through the use of robotics and autonomous systems. I think it's very obvious that we are driving towards more man-machine and more semi-autonomous, and then ultimately autonomous battle space. And then finally, the third thing would be the networking itself. So if you go back to my description of analytic superiority, it's not only the networking that's required to grab data and then ultimately turn it into something useful using artificial intelligence, but it's also the way that we're going to communicate with those autonomous systems and with the human decision makers and between those autonomous systems so that we can be the most efficient that we can in the battle space. And so I would focus in those three areas.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, you and I lived this when we were in the government, the evolving nature of war to more autonomous, systems, and with drone development and asynchronous warfare. Essentially, you could have the Houthis using relatively low-cost drones, and the U.S. and our allies would fire really expensive missiles to take them down, and it basically leveled the playing field with those adversaries that don't have the resources that the U.S. has. So we're going to need, my opinion, when we talk about investment in autonomous systems, look for cheap autonomous systems as well. We don't have to have the slickest, the best. We need effective autonomous systems and we can, with our resources, we can deploy more of them, quantity, perhaps at lesser quality, but to counter the adversary that doesn't have that level of resource. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in fact, I refer to this, I think you described it very well, as the age of asymmetry. Mm-hmm. And so what are we going to do about the age of asymmetry, and how do we get that balance right? Because obviously right now we don't have that balance right.
Yep. So, Greg, earlier Rob, keynote speaker, talked about China's rapid investment in open source AI models. So what lessons can U.S. learn from what they've done in this field, such as the development of DeepSeek, and despite the restrictions on advanced compute power?
Obviously, DeepSeek is an interesting lesson for us innovators and the amount of investment that we're making in this space, where although there's various arguments relative to the security and capabilities of DeepSeek, it's clear that with more investment and more security, DeepSeek is going to develop into a worthy adversary for us. And so, their open sourcing of that technology, I think, is something that we need to recognize, that we're not going to be able to stop them from being able to develop these technologies. I think regulation would be very bad for, and the administration is talking I think, quite properly relative to making sure that regulation does not slow us down, because China's not going to play by those rules. And so if we continue to keep our foot on the accelerator and the investment in technologies that are open sourced so that we can all build these systems of systems that you're talking about that are going to be necessary to win on the battlefield. And I loved your multi-tier approach to watching agents. I think we're going to need more and more of those systems of systems and investment from an open source perspective to be successful.
So when we talk AI and national security, we talk that's massive. Lots of different aspects. So, Charlie, from your perspective, what aspect of AI, when we're talking national security, tends to be forgotten?
I think the strategic level, especially inside the Department of Defense. I mean, we always want to go down to the tactical level because that tends to be the most fun and where you see, where the rubber meets the road. But at the strategic level, we really need to put more thought into how we're going to use artificial intelligence tools to really help us with the ability to assess what's going on in the environment, to be in a persistent state of planning, to be in the persistent state of providing the best advice and or decisions to our human decision makers based on the geopolitical environment, based on the strategic objectives the United States has laid out for itself, and being able to do that at speed, including all of our operations, our actions, our investments, and our messaging. I think that is what is going to be extremely, extremely important to maintain this national security edge. The other aspect that I would mention real quickly is I do believe we're at the point where the tools can give us the capability to not only do what I just described, but at the same time really affect the cognitive perceptions of our adversaries. At the end of the day, warfare is all about the cognitive perceptions of your adversaries, right? You're trying to convince them to change their behavior. They change that behavior based on what they observe. And we can use these tools to greatly impact what our adversaries see and how they interpret the environment, not just to make it more beneficial to the United States, but I think we can go all the way to the level of getting them to take actions and operations and make investments that are actually counter to their best interest.
Thanks. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit for the last few minutes here. So everybody's been seeing what's been going on with the new administration and DOGE efforts, reduce the size of the government and so on. So I just want to go, just right down the line, start with Kristen, to Greg, and then Charlie, in terms of what are your thoughts regarding the impact of a brain drain with folks that are being cut from government? And it can be any department because, as my view, economic security equals national security, so it applies across the board. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer in terms of AI rather than a particular department because that's sort of where I live. And I think about this sort of at two levels. A lot of the core technological advances we're seeing coming from private industry, right? The breakthrough that everybody saw with ChatGPT, the work on LLMs that enabled that, the continued evolution of the foundation models. However, in order to make that real for a particular mission and to use it safely and securely in all the ways we've been talking about today, it's really important to have people who are totally integrated into the organization and mission, who deeply understand that technology and who can make calls about things like what is happening between these agents, or what are the risks in the way this is accessing the data? How can I ensure that it's respecting my access controls and those kinds of things? And so that's kind of the way I think about that risk of the brain drain, is that you need all of those other capabilities and they need to be well grounded in AI. And if I can just sort of make an analogy, in our data and AI practice at Mantech, we have data scientists and we have data engineers. We also have what we call AI application developers and AI systems architects, because the way we do those activities even though they sound like general, sort of computer science software development activities, the way we do them for data-driven and AI systems is different and requires a deep understanding of what's happening with the data science, the data analytics, and the AI. And so that's sort of where I think about that concern very much.
All right, thanks, Greg.
Yeah, I'm going to just kind of follow on what Kristen said. I think there may be a need for a cultural change in agencies. And our practitioners, although there are some that are great from an AI and data analytics perspective, and we need to hang on to those folks, it's a great opportunity to change the culture of government agencies so that they are aligned with those development processes, have the technical skills and abilities, and tap into what you guys are doing from the ecosystem of the entrepreneur perspective, where we can contribute to be able to accelerate the adoption and leverage AI for our national security interests.
So obviously, if as we go through these efficiency drills, I mean, it really looks a lot like zero-based budgeting, if you will. And if we're removing people from governmental positions that have the skills and the capabilities and the talent, like what we're been discussing up here, then that's very concerning. So that said, I'm an optimist. So let me give you some end on some positive notes. One, I think if you've been following like what's been going on with the Department of Energy and some of the individuals that were originally let go that dealt with nuclear weapons and nuclear surety, those people were turned around and brought right back on after they realized that they cut too deep and they cut too far. So I'm hopeful that maybe if we're seeing some of that happen with the folks inside the cyber and AI realm, that we can perform those same functions. Second, I think the administration is indicating that they understand the talent that's necessary. It's part of the core approach that they've mentioned in the EO and in the Vice President's speech. So I'd hope that would feed into the fact that they understand that we need to have these people and we need to cultivate them and keep them in government service. And then finally, real quickly, I would say, if you go back to the strategy that I described, that's whole of society, we probably shouldn't view this as a zero-sum game, right? And if we take a lot of the approaches that we should, just because someone leaves government service, well, how easy is it are we making for them to come back in or to occasionally come in and act as a consultant or a help with some type of operation when some type of crisis arrives, and make that flow back and forth between private and public sector a lot more seamless. I think we can do that.
Yeah, I've always been a huge advocate of making that membrane transparent or easier to go back and forth between public and private, which I think is really important today and into the future. So we're out of time here. I'll just finish up, hit a couple things we talked about early on, that there's so much going on in the AI world, largely at the tactical level, which is important. And I harken back to the keynote speaker Rob talking about his toaster example, with the electricity and the plug-in. Well, what comes next? I mean, I really believe, with all these tactical AI implementations, what's coming next is how do we integrate them in a way to strategic effect, from at higher levels, and not just for national security, but other strategic implications across the board. So I think capabilities that help with risk identification at the strategic level and risk acceptance and mitigation of those risks are going to be very valuable going forward. So thanks very much. Appreciate it. And appreciate the time.
Thank you.